Alex woke early, as usual, to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a pale amber glow into the bedroom. He rolled over several times, afraid to wake his wife, but Sarah was gone, already getting ready for her morning yoga. Alex sighed heavily and crawled out from under the covers. The day was starting like any other. The kitchen had the familiar casualness of a morning, the same one that had seemed cozy in the early years of marriage, but now seemed to leave a slight trace of fatigue. The coffee pot on the stove, old and chipped in places, slowly poured out a thick stream of strong, but still watery coffee. The aroma barely touched the air, not waking you up, but rather reminding you that the morning had already begun, whether you wanted it or not. On the table was a half-empty bowl of cereal, softened to a pulp, and a children's book with dog-eared pages, abandoned in a hurry, as if someone had tried to finish it between sips of milk and requests to pull on socks. Light slowly filtered through the translucent curtains, drawing warm stripes on the floor. The walls, once painted a light lemon color, now bore the marks of time. A handprint here, a shadow from Lou's long-removed drawings there. The children were no longer making noise in the house. 6-year-old Lou and 10-month-old Harrison were having breakfast in the bedroom, under the supervision of their nanny, a young girl with gentle manners, a reserved voice, and an expression of eternal patience on her face. Lou, with her disheveled blonde hair and her cheeks smeared with porridge, sat in a chair like a little princess on a throne, telling with a serious look about a dream full of unicorns and sparkling rainbows. Her voice rang like a high silver bell, and her eyes sparkled with delight. Harrison, plump and rosy-cheeked, with surprisingly expressive eyes, lazily reached for his mother, grasping the air with his fingers and making contented sounds. Alex stood at the sink, his hands resting on the cool edge of the counter. Tall, with slightly tousled brown hair and a light stubble, he seemed like a figure from another time, silent, slightly distant, as if frozen inwardly in search of something that had long since slipped away. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, lingered on the children, and the corners of his lips twitched in a faint smile. It was not joy, but the shadow of a memory of it. Something warmed inside and then died. Sarah walked into the kitchen with a light, almost silent step, the scent of morning lotion and fresh sweat from her run lingering behind her like a plume. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, now seemed more golden in the sun, pulled back into a loose ponytail with strands escaping. She wore a tight sports bra that showed off her graceful but slightly thin figure, and a sweater that hugged her shoulders. There was a slight shadow under her eyes from lack of sleep, and a businesslike focus in her gaze, as if she was already mentally running through a schedule of meetings, tasks, and purchases. "Good morning," she said, kissing Alex's cheek almost automatically, like a checklist item. Her lips were cool, and her fingers were shaking, more from haste and caffeine than from excitement. Alex silently put down his mug. He didn't respond with the usual good morning, or even linger his gaze on her, as before. Not out of anger, but because he seemed to have no more words left to express this everyday closeness. The silence between them had long since become not a sign of resentment, but a way of being. Sarah, either not noticing it or pretending not to, clutched her yoga bag tighter to her, the new accessory in her life, as if physical activity could reassemble her into the woman she had been before giving birth. She ran out, barely touching the floor, leaving behind a barely audible sound of the door closing. Alex remained standing, as if rooted to the floor. The space became empty. The room seemed to shrink, even the air became heavier. The feeling of being in someone else's home, the bed already made, Sarah's towel unhung, her phone lying on the edge of the table like a silent reproach, was an unexpected weight, as if her life itself had begun to happen outside these walls. And this morning there was no drama, no loud argument, no tears. Just emptiness. Just that strange cold that slowly creeps into what used to be warm. A day away. Alex sat down at his desk in his home office, turned on his computer, and one after another, emails from his new job began to appear. Code, reports, projects. Video calls, reports, technical problems, a new project in it always kept him on his toes. But even in the busiest moments of attention, through the streams of numbers and lines of code, his thoughts returned to home, to Sarah, to that empty look she gave him one last time before leaving. In the evening, when the nursery behind the door fell silent, and the nanny softly said good night and quietly left, the house sank into that special evening silence in which sounds suddenly acquired weight. The clock on the wall beat out the rhythm of a tired day, the floorboards creaked in the hallway, and in the kitchen the oven crackled lazily as a roast chicken burned to the end. The aroma of thyme, garlic, and golden brown crust filled the space, as if creating the illusion of coziness homely, real, although long forgotten. Alex, in a simple gray t-shirt, and with his sleeves rolled up, carefully chopped vegetables, cucumbers, tomatoes, some greens. The blade of the knife softly rustled on the cutting board. He was not in a hurry. This was his quiet attempt to maintain order in the house, in his life, in himself. There was no particular emotion on his face, but his shoulders sagged a little lower than usual. He was tired. The door slammed a little louder than it needed to when Sarah entered, as if tired of her destiny as part of the silence. She had shrugged out of the sports jacket she was still wearing despite it being evening. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was slightly tangled, like someone who had spent the day struggling with her tasks, with herself, with the thought that she hadn't gotten everything done yet again. "Hi," she breathed out, setting her bag down by the table and almost sliding into the nearest chair. "Hi," Alex replied without raising his head from his salad. He handed her the plate, and she nodded her thanks but did not smile. Sarah picked up a fork, picked up some lettuce, and ate, as if by necessity, not by desire. For a few seconds, there was only the clatter of dishes and the muffled murmur of news from the living room, coming through the half-closed door. "How's the day?" she asked, more out of habit. "Fine. There's not much work." Harrison started to get to his feet by the couch. I thought maybe he'd be going soon. His voice was calm, almost mechanical. "Okay." Sarah chewed, not taking her eyes off her plate. "We've been completely swamped in the office. Project deadline. Stayed at a meeting past 6 again." Silence. Empty, gray, like the wall between them. Alex glanced at Sarah through the doorway, where the soft light from the overhead lamp fell. Her figure seemed distant, as if she were in another room, not 2 meters away. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms over her chest, and continued eating, occasionally picking at her salad with lazy concentration. There was a casualness in her posture, a kind of distant irritation, not at him, but rather at the world. He wanted to say something about the kids, about himself, about how Harrison had grabbed his nose and laughed, about how Lou had tried to draw a rainbow but had only come up with 2 colors. But it all suddenly seemed stupid, out of place. He ate his potatoes in silence and felt not a fight brewing between them, but worse, silence. Later, after putting the children to bed, he placed a mug of cold coffee on the windowsill. Outside, the night wind was sauntering among the trees. The leaves rustled, falling into the darkness, and the sky seemed to be covered with gray glass. Water gurgled in the bathroom. Sarah was washing herself with the door closed, and this sound, familiar, rhythmic, suddenly seemed alarming to Alex like a countdown. He sat down in a chair by the window. His body felt alien, too heavy, too tired. He looked into the darkness, but in reality he was looking inside himself. When Sarah came out, now in a soft dressing gown, she walked past him without saying a word. Her face was blank, as if she had forgotten that she was supposed to feel anything. He watched her go, but didn't call out to her. Later, in bed, Alex lay down first. He heard Sarah dialing something on the phone in the bathroom. The light under the door flickered on and off. He wasn't expecting her. He wasn't expecting a conversation. He just lay there, looking out the window, and saw himself reflected there, alone, in the dark. When Sarah lay down next to him, the bed creaked slightly. He didn't turn over. She didn't either. "Do you want to say something?" Sarah suddenly asked without opening her eyes. Alex hesitated. He felt the single word trembling in his throat. "Yes." But it did not come out. He said, "No, everything is fine." She turned away silently. Several minutes passed. Then Sarah said, barely audible, almost in her sleep, "You're still here, aren't you?" Alex didn't answer right away. He looked at the ceiling. "I don't know," he whispered, so quietly that even he wasn't sure if he said it out loud. And in this silence, among the rustling of the blanket and breathing that became a little louder than it should have been, Alex felt that their love was still alive, but like an old lamp, burning with a dim light, barely noticeable in the darkness. For now, it still flickered. But whether it was worth trying to light the flame again, he did not know. He just lay there, and slowly, like the first rain after a long drought, the thought sank into his chest. If they didn't talk, if they didn't touch, if they didn't decide something, it would soon be too late. With the arrival of autumn, the days became less intense. The sunlit evenings were replaced by early blue twilight, quiet courtyards, and dampness that seeped even through the walls. The windows of houses began to glow much earlier, and the city sounded muffled, as if the air itself had become softer, but also heavier, like a wet wool coat. Alex began to sense a strange tension, hidden in the little things. It wasn't sharp like an alarm, and it didn't ring like a bell. It was the silence between sentences, the slight hesitation in Sarah's answers, the barely noticeable absence of his gaze when he was telling a story. At first, he didn't pay any attention to it. Sarah had always been energetic, independent, and had a knack for finding inspiration in the most diverse corners of the world. She could disappear into the layout of a model for a day, spend an evening drawing, and discuss lectures on architecture with such a sparkle in her eyes, as if they were talking about a trip to another planet. But now everything looked different. Before, she would share at least in short remarks, "Listen, I spoke to a woman today. She's going to remodel her house in the style of Northern Art Nouveau." And he would nod, pick up on it, even if he understood little about it. But now the stories are gone. Just a summary. There was a meeting, then stopped by the studio. I stayed late in the library. No faces, no stories, no emotions. In the mornings, she was in a hurry, neatly dressed, with her hair done and lightly made up, the smell of fresh coffee and her perfume lingering in the air longer than her presence. She seemed to glide through the house, leaving no trace quickly, deftly, neutrally. Alex began to feel like an observer, not a participant. He got up earlier more and more often, just to hear her steps in the hallway, to see her fasten her watch, check her phone, throw out a short, "I'll be later, don't wait up." And if before he followed her with his eyes with slight anxiety, now a strange, icy emptiness grew inside. Sarah did begin to disappear. Not physically, she still came home, ate dinner, showered, did her hair before bed. But there was an absence in her eyes. She spoke less, answered more briefly. Sometimes she smiled, as if to be polite. Sometimes he tried to joke, but her laughter was shallow, without its former husky note of pleasure. One evening, when she had already gone to take a shower, Alex stood by the window. A cold wind blew outside the glass, driving orange leaves along the asphalt. In the reflection, he saw himself the same man, but with a slightly duller look, with wrinkles in the corners of his eyes that he had not noticed before. He ran his hand over his chin, as if he wanted to erase those years, but only sighed. He began to observe. Not suspiciously, but rather wistfully. He began to notice little things. She even took her phone with her to the bathroom now. Notifications came almost silently, but sometimes a shadow would cross her face, as if the message were interrupting her thoughts. One early morning, he noticed an appointment on her calendar, listed simply and without explanation. 12 o'clock Volta Cafe. No name, no topic. Just a dot on the map. She didn't mention it, and it shifted something inside him, like a tiny crack in glass that you can't see yet, but you already know it's there. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He didn't want to be the one who pries into the soul, who demands accountability, who destroys the remains of a fragile balance with his doubts. But fear was growing in him. Not loud. It sat quietly, deep, like a root under the ground from which shadows creep. And every night, when Sarah fell asleep first, he lay with his eyes open, staring into the darkness that no longer held the warmth of her breath. She lay beside him, and yet not with him. and he began to ask himself a question that made his insides clench. When did we lose each other? And is it still possible to find us? One evening, when the house was enveloped in silence like a soft blanket, Alex sat in the living room with his phone in his hand. The screen glowed dimly, the news changed silently, but he did not read. His fingers moved automatically. Thoughts scattered like beads, and not a single one could gather into a coherent feeling. In the kitchen, the dishwasher indicator blinked. The clock in the hallway ticked quietly. He kept waiting for Sarah to return to the living room with a cup of tea, with a stock phrase, with anything. But time passed, and she did not come. 10, 15 minutes passed, and suddenly he realized she had lingered in the bedroom longer than usual. Too long, not like a person changing clothes after a shower, not like a wife choosing pajamas, but like someone who has distanced herself, who lives in a parallel space and simply uses the closed door as a boundary. Something inside him clicked. Alex put the phone down, stood up, and tiptoed toward the hallway, barely touching the floor. The bedroom was just a few meters away. The children were already asleep in their room. Harrison was barely audibly snoring, and Lou was occasionally sighing quietly, rolling over in her sleep. Alex didn't want to disturb them. He stopped at the door and was about to knock, but then he heard a quiet sigh. Not her usual, tired, deep nasal one. This one was more nervous, tense. Then a short female laugh, hers, muffled, as if restrained, and then a man's voice, velvety, with some kind of soft accent. The intonations were calm, almost intimate, with a light half-whisper, as if the person was saying something not intended for other people's ears. Alex did not make out the words, only the rhythm, the sound, the atmosphere. He froze. His ears began to buzz, as they do when you dive into water. His pulse pounded in his temples, and the air seemed to thicken, to become viscous. It seemed as if even the walls were holding their breath. He took a tiny step forward, his hand involuntarily raising itself to knock, to break in Talkatch. But she didn't touch the tree. It froze like a puppet whose strings had suddenly snapped. And then a sound, quiet but distinct, the sound of laptop keys closing. A click. Sarah stood up. He barely managed to jump back, disappearing around the corner into the corridor. Her steps were unhurried, but for some reason too cautious, almost inaudible, like those of a person who wants to avoid a meeting. She came out into the light of the living room, already in a house jacket, with a face devoid of emotion. There was no smile, but no guilt either. "Are the children all right?" she asked as she passed by. "Yes," Alex answered, his voice sounding strangely muffled. He looked after her, and his heart did not beat. It stood, waiting for a blow that hadn't come yet. He walked into the bedroom. The air was warm, smelling faintly of perfume and faintly of hot plastic from the laptop. A phone lay on the nightstand, face down. Everything looked normal, and everything was not so. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor, as if trying to find answers in the pile of the carpet. Somewhere between the floor and the walls and the crackling of the electric lights, the first real, dull thud of doubt sounded in his head. Don't panic. Not jealousy, but inevitability, a shadow that can no longer be ignored. The kitchen was filled with the familiar aroma of morning coffee, but instead of coziness, there was tension in the air, almost palpable, like electricity before a thunderstorm. Alex sat at the table, cupping his hands around his mug, as if trying to warm not his hands, but his thoughts. Sarah walked in silently, in a familiar tempo. A quick step, a glance to the side, a coffee mug from the cabinet, a hand running through her hair, as if chasing away the remnants of sleep or nerves. He watched her, almost detachedly, like someone watching a scene from a movie where close people are playing, but whom you no longer recognize. She poured herself some coffee, took a spoon from the windowsill, and only then did he speak. "You're home late. Meeting again?" The words came out naturally, without pressure, like a mundane question. But inside, everything burned like boiling water. Sarah froze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she raised the mug to her lips. She didn't look at him, only nodded, looking down at her cup. "With another client." "Nothing special," she said, taking a step back toward the wall. He nodded, calmly, even with a soft half-smile, as if he was just making conversation. But his heart was beating so hard that it seemed like the cup in his hands was about to ring. "It's late for a customer," he remarked, taking a sip. "It's almost 12. Sarah shrugged. "There are traffic jams in the city. We stayed in the coffee shop for a while. We discussed options for decorating the space." "Space?" he asked, looking at her a little more closely. She nodded quickly. "The gallery on Petrovka. One client wants to transform it into a cultural center. We discussed lighting, materials." She paused for a second. "And also the format of the events. It's very demanding." Alex was silent, listening intently. He knew how she spoke when she was genuinely passionate about a project, and this was not it. This was something else, a tightening between phrases, a drawn-out pause, an internal struggle. "Is he the one with the accent?" he asked suddenly, deliberately softly but directly. Sarah looked up slowly, something flashing in her eyes, almost fear, but more like an internal blow she had dealt herself. "What?" she asked again, quietly, almost in a whisper. "I heard a voice. That evening. Through the door." He put the mug on the table, carefully, without any sudden movements. "A man's. With an accent. You were laughing." She looked at him for a long time, and finally, she looked away. "It doesn't mean anything, Alex. Just a conversation. About work." Her voice trembled slightly. "You shouldn't make anything more of it." "But you didn't tell me." "Not then, not later." He spoke quietly, but with restraint. "Neither the name nor the essence. You usually share, and here's silence." Sarah took a deep breath, as if struggling with something inside. "Because I knew how you would react. You would start asking questions, searching. I just want to understand what's going on," he whispered. "I feel you slipping away, like you're not here." She closed her eyes for a second. "I'm not slipping away. I'm just tired." "Are you tired of me?" he asked, and for the first time a crack crept into his voice. Silence. Sarah looked at the mug in her hands as if the answer was there, and yet she did not speak. He didn't insist. He just pushed back his chair, stood up, and headed towards the kitchen exit. Before disappearing into the hallway, he said, "At least tell me, should I be afraid?" Sarah didn't answer. She just clutched the mug with her fingers, as if she was afraid it would fall out. And in that silence between the question and her silence, Alex realized the fear is already inside. The days flowed like autumn drops on glass, slowly, indifferently, leaving only a trace behind them. Alex noticed more and more often. Sarah got ready faster than before. She hardly ate breakfast, did not linger in the kitchen, and her "until the evening" sounded mechanical, as if addressed not to him, but to the empty room. He tried not to pay attention to it, blaming it on the season, on fatigue, on work. But the internal tension was building up. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Sarah sat on the edge of the sofa, her head glued to her phone. Alex was in the kitchen, making himself some tea, and he saw the corners of her lips twitch a slight, almost shy smile that disappeared too quickly. He froze. He looked closely. Her fingers were typing quickly, and phrases flashed on the screen, accompanied by emoticons, not office ones, not dry ones, but somehow personal. He came closer, and she instantly turned off the screen. "Who is it?" he asked, quietly, but in a barely restrained tone. Sarah looked up, calm, almost stubborn. "One client, I told you." "The one you lingered with at the coffee shop?" he asked. "Alex," she exhaled tiredly, putting the phone aside. "Are you starting an interrogation?" "No, I'm just asking. For the first time in a week, you're smiling, and not at me." She remained silent. Then, a little tensely, she added, "I don't have to show you everything. This is my job, my life. Our life, to be precise," he said, already with a slight bitterness. "Or have I missed something?" Sarah looked away. "Do you want to hear that I'm in love? That I'm having an affair?" "Well, no, Alex. I'm not having an affair. But there are fewer and fewer of us." She paused. He froze as if he had been doused with ice water. "You don't even fight," he whispered. You just pull away and wait for me to stop asking. And all you can do is keep quiet while everything is falling apart. We are both lost, Alex. Not today, not yesterday, a long time ago. He wanted to answer something, but instead of words, only a heavy sigh came out. So that's it, he asked. Are you there with him already? Sarah looked down. I don't know where I am yet. I just feel better with him. You know, he listens, laughs at my nonsense, and asks for my opinion. I feel alive, not part of a schedule. Alex turned away, the words digging into his skin like needles. What am I? Dead? A splinter? Sleep mode? No. Her voice wavered. You're part of my life. Fatherhood. Home. Everything. But not me. Not who I sometimes want to be. You could have told me. Earlier. When it was still possible to save something. Sarah slowly stood up from the sofa. You could have noticed earlier. When I stopped smiling. She went into the bedroom, leaving him standing in the kitchen, amid the dim light and the sound of a spoon in a cup. Alex sat in silence for a long time that night, feeling how their home solid, filled with children's voices and memories, had begun to sound different, like a foreign place. The tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly burst out, not loudly, not with a scream, but suddenly, like a sigh of a draft in a tightly closed house. It happened in the middle of the night. Alex woke up from the sharp vibration of his phone, which was lying on his bedside table. He didn't immediately understand where he was. His consciousness was wandering in some kind of viscous fog of sleep. He sat up, wiped his face, and only then looked at the screen. Under the light of a dim lamp, the display glowed with an alien name, Gentry Holmes. The number was not saved. Seconds. 2. Something inside stirred. Intuition. Not anxiety, but almost instinct. Pick up the phone. Hello? His voice sounded hoarse, barely recognizable. A female voice answered on the other end of the line, cheerful, delicate, politely familiar, like that of a secretary or event coordinator. Hello, sorry to disturb you at this late hour. I'm calling from Gentry Holmes. This is Sarah's, the designer's, husband. Alex froze. A strange wave squeezed his chest. He glanced sideways toward the bedroom. Sarah was sleeping peacefully, her back to him, breathing evenly. Well, yes. What's the matter? It's all right, the woman continued easily, as if there hadn't been midnight between them. Daniel just sent a message. He asked me to remind Sarah that she deserved to rest and to say good night. You'll probably be together in the morning, so. The phrase broke off. Without explanation. The woman seemed to have stopped. Alex froze. He didn't immediately understand what exactly was said. The name is Daniel. It sounded as if with an echo, as if from the depths of a long-forgotten past. He repeated it almost in a whisper, not to himself, but into space. Daniel. There was silence on the other end, almost theatrical. No response, just that dull background into which casual conversations usually disappear. Hello, he said a little louder. Click. The call ended. Alex remained sitting with the phone in his hand, as if it were an object that had lost its meaning. His palms were sweaty. He glanced at Sarah. She had not moved, as if she had never woken up, as if she was far away and not in a dream. He put the phone down, but there was no more sleep. His body felt cottony, cold, as if everything inside him had been poured out into the frost. Thoughts were racing madly, colliding and not forming a clear picture. Who is Daniel? Why are they calling me? Why not her? Why is this intimately deserves rest? Good night. The morning was gray, heavy, and cold. The kind that even the birds hesitate to sing. Alex hadn't slept much of the night. He felt the emptiness in his body slowly growing into a sharp tension, an internal heat that didn't warm him, but burned him. In the mirror, he saw a tired face with deep shadows under his eyes. Even his movements were hesitant, as if he had become thinner and more transparent overnight. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he noticed that Sarah was still wearing the same t-shirt she'd worn to bed the night before. He suddenly became aware of a small detail. The fabric was slightly torn at the hem, a hole that hadn't been there before. The scent was faint, almost imperceptible lavender, his favorite scent, but he'd never smelled it so vividly in the morning before. Everything about her was beginning to feel different, unfamiliar, distant. They hardly spoke at breakfast, only familiar, mechanical phrases. "I will be late today. We have a presentation with a client," said Sarah, looking at the screen of her phone. Alex nodded without asking who. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew there would be no answer. At lunch, in the office kitchen, Alex sat by the window, lazily stirring his cold soup with a spoon. The usual bustle hummed around him. Someone was heating up food in the microwave, someone was joking at the coffee machine, someone was scrolling through their phones, staring at the screen. The space was familiar, almost impersonal. Plastic tables, metal chairs, lamps with cold light, the reflection of which gave people a slightly tired, gray look. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He was just eating, chewing, not tasting, staring intently at his plate, when two colleagues at the next table started talking. Their conversation passed him by at first, like background noise, but one word pierced him like a thorn. "Sarah. Have you heard about Sarah?" one of them asked, pouring himself some tea from the shared thermos. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Who?" "Oh, the designer, the one they call a builder." Yeah, the other one answered with a grin. "They say she's dating some guy. An architect. I think he flew in from Paris. Daniel, maybe?" Alex didn't move. The spoon full of soup hung in the air. Something stirred in his chest, not fear, not anger, but a strange dull ringing, as if the glass inside had cracked. "He seems to have recently gotten divorced," the second one continued. "He and Sarah were at the exhibition, I think. It was all work-related, but you know how it is, especially when they are so often delayed on projects." Laughter. Stifled, not angry, but to Alex it sounded like an insult. He swallowed, but his mouth remained dry, as if his tongue had turned to paper. The spoon fell into the plate with a splash. No one noticed. He rose slowly. His movements were abrupt, unnatural, as if his body was in pain. The truth was approaching. In the evening, when the house was quiet and the children's last steps had disappeared into the walls, Alex locked the bedroom door like shutters on a shelter. He sat down at the table, turned on the laptop, and for a moment the air around him seemed to stop moving. Everything happened with silent determination, with that silence that only those who have already crossed the threshold of doubt inwardly know. He knew Sarah's email password by heart, not because he wanted to control her, but because they had once been one. Created together, back in the days when trust didn't require confirmation. He entered the combination, his fingers not shaking, his movements precise. And when the email opened, he almost hoped he would be wrong. Almost. There was nothing unusual in his inbox. Work correspondence, newsletters, notifications. But he clicked on deleted. And there they were. Letters, carefully erased from the surface, but left in the digital shadows. The first message he opened greeted him with soft words, written as if for someone's ear, not to be read. "You are strong. You can do this. I'm here for you. You are my light. I miss you even in the middle of the day, D." He didn't blink. His attention was extremely sharp. He read slowly, as if each word had to be remembered forever. Scrolled down. "I think about you more often than I should. Forgive me, but I can't do otherwise." No embellishments, no allegories. The line between them was as straight and clean as a blade. Not a colleague, not a project partner, but a man who had become so much more to her. And there was an answer. Signed, Daniel D. "You're all that keeps me going. Sometimes I feel like you're the only one who's really there. Sometimes I want to give up everything just for an evening with you. For the silence. For the way you look at me when you think I don't notice." Alex leaned forward slightly. His jaw clenched. He continued reading. The screen glowed steadily, without flickering. He didn't need proof it was here. Not guesses. Not shadows. Facts. He reached the last line. "I want to be with you, not just in workspaces, in reality. He leaned back in his chair. The room around him was the same, the familiar walls, the bedside lamp, Lou's childhood drawing on the dresser. But everything was different. The world no longer had the same weight. It was as if something had been torn away and was gone forever from the center of gravity. Alex slowly closed the letter, then the laptop. His fingers, still confident, carefully folded on the lid. No sudden movements, no explosion. Everything was boiling inside him, but it didn't spill out. He looked ahead into the darkness of the room. Silent. He didn't need a violent reaction. He didn't tear, he didn't hit. It was all too clear and too late. Now he knew. He had no idea, no suspicion knew. He has been alone in this relationship for a long time, and the one who is next to him has been with someone else for a long time, mentally, emotionally, with her heart, and maybe even with her body. This letter was enough to stop looking for excuses, to stop clinging to illusions. Alex stood up. His movements were precise, like a man who had made a decision. His back straightened, his gaze remained direct. He did not need to confirm his strength. It was in the fact that he endured, accepted, lived, didn't flinch. And even though the night rolled over the windows like an icy wave, he stayed on the surface. Tomorrow he would tell her everything, not in a shout, not in a reproach, but as a man who had been silent for too long. And now there won't be any more. He stood up, picked up his laptop, and threw it into his bag. His hands were shaking, his breathing was ragged. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew that something in him had finally broken. The pain had replaced the confusion. Later, in the middle of the night, he was again rushing between the kitchen and the bedroom. He was looking at old photographs, their faces filled with sincerity against the backdrop of the lake at the wedding on Lou's birthday. Where did it all disappear? When? At what point did they become strangers? He whispered into the darkness. "Why did you leave without telling me?" As if in response, only silence. There was no guilt in it, only a distance that could no longer be measured. When he finally lay down, he lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. And in that stillness was a decision, a bitter, mature one. The dawn already brought the truth, and he would meet it not as a weakling, not as a victim, but as a man who deserved to know what's left of love. And what will happen to him now? The first rays of the sun, still weak but already perceptible, glided along the windowsill, stretching along the floor like thin threads. Morning came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the world was afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the house, where everything was no longer as before. Alex, exhausted from sleepless nights, came into the kitchen before everyone else for the first time in days. His steps were sluggish, but there was a determination in them, like a soldier who knows the battle will happen anyway. He poured himself coffee without adding sugar or milk as before. Habit. But the taste was burning, his teeth chattered involuntarily from the strain, and his face twisted into a grimace not from the bitterness of the drink, but from the bitterness inside. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen cabinet. Dull, reddened eyes, lips pressed into a thin line, and heavy, almost purple bags under his eyes, traces of nights in which there was no sleep, only thoughts. Thoughts that gnawed like rust. Sarah cheated. That one phrase, like an anchor, was dragging him down. He repeated it to himself, not as an accusation, but as an admission that he had lost control of his own reality. They had lain side by side for so many years, building a family, raising children, dreaming of a dacha, traveling, old age in armchairs by the window. And now, like neighbors, people who shared space but not feelings, people who increasingly dined in silence. Lou's clear voice came from behind the door. Wake up already. Harrison is crying." Then came a thin, piercing child's cry. Alex mechanically stood up, put on his shirt without looking at the buttons, and headed for the nursery. He sat on the edge of the bed, put his son on his lap, stroked his head, trying to drown out the roar with gentle, quiet words. Lou's pajamas rustled nearby. She was already excitedly telling something to the plush bunny. At that moment, the door swung open and Sarah walked in easily, as if her morning had been flooded with sunlight. New manicure, formal skirt, confident stride, and a smile too wide, too fast, as if rehearsed in front of a mirror. There was a familiar gleam in her eyes, but now it seemed alien to Alex. He didn't know to whom exactly this joy was addressed, but he knew not him. "Good morning, my dears," she exclaimed, leaning towards the children. Alex, still holding Harrison in his arms, gave a soft, neutral smile. "Good morning, children," he said in an even voice. He didn't answer Sarah. She didn't pay attention or pretended to. The day passed like a mechanism covered in honey, slowly, stickily, painfully. Alex sat in the office, turning off all notifications. His phone was lying next to him, but he didn't want to know. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to guess from the tone of her messages whether she was writing to him or to someone else. He was tired of being the guardian of his suspicions. Sarah avoided personal contact all day. No calls, no messages, no clarification about the children. In general chats, there were routine phrases. When they did cross paths at home, her voice sounded friendly, but even as if there was a thin glass partition between them through which everything was visible, but the heart could no longer be heard. He felt the house filling with foreign scents. Sarah's perfume, which had once awakened desire in him, now seemed to scream for another presence. Her phone, vibrating in the other room, sounded like the pulse of a double life. The subtle notes of music coming from her headphones no longer matched the ones that had once been on their shared playlist. And yet he held on. He didn't allow himself any hysteria or scenes, not for her sake, but for himself, for the sake of the children, for the sake of the memory of those years where honesty still lived. But every indifferent, "I'll be late," every casual touch on the shoulder, every avoidance of gaze, all of it was like little nails in the coffin of what they once called us. By midday, he could no longer hold back. Everything inside him was clenching. His fingers were shaking. His temples were pounding. There was a lump in his throat. It seemed that if he didn't speak up now, he would burn from the inside. He found Sarah in the hallway, just about to leave. "Sarah," his voice was firm, but on the verge of breaking, "we need to talk." She paused. For a split second, her face tensed, as if her muscles knew what was coming before they even realized it. She nodded, wordlessly. She was ready not for everything, but for the beginning. They walked into the living room. Alex sat in the chair where he had been reading, the book now lying on the armrest, forgotten like everything else. Sarah stood leaning against the back of the sofa, her arms crossed like armor. He was silent for a long time, his knees clenched. His lips trembled from restraint, not from weakness. When he spoke, his voice was low and even. "This can't go on," he exhaled. "I can see that something has broken between us. I feel it in every cell. You've pulled away. You're not with me." Sarah said nothing, only looked away, frozen in some kind of tense indifference. This silence pushed Alex forward. "I know." He looked up, straight at her. "I know everything. I know about Daniel, about the letters, about the exhibition, about you who no longer needs me." He did not shout. These words sounded not like an accusation, but like a sentence. The phrase he uttered without trembling was the hardest. "You cheated on me." Sarah turned pale. She pressed her lips together, but did not lower her eyes. Several emotions were frozen in her gaze: fear, anger, and something that looked like shame. "How dare you?" she said quietly but clearly. "How could you?" he answered immediately, barely pausing. "How could you destroy what we spent years building? For what?" Sarah lowered her head, touching her lips with her fingers, a gesture she was accustomed to when she was at a loss, but now it seemed almost forced. "I didn't plan it. It wasn't intended, Alex." "Then what was it?" He leaned forward. "Spontaneity? Passion? Or simply family fatigue?" She said nothing. His voice grew harder, but still did not lose control. "You stole our marriage from me. Our life, our children, they deserve honesty, not lies. And I was blind. I kept trying to justify it, to explain to myself that you were getting tired, that you were just closing yourself off. But you just left, only physically remained. You want me to explain everything? Sarah exhaled sharply. I don't even know how it started. I was lonely, Alex. I'd come home and there would be a wall. You were always inside yourself. In code, in business, in silence. And he listened. So you decided? Go where you are heard. He stood up, straight, calm. Instead of telling me about it, instead of fighting. And would you have heard? She snapped. You would have remained silent, joked, nodded. We both lost each other, and you know it. He fell silent. The pause was long. Then, more quietly, you can leave. You can choose him. It's your right. He spoke almost emotionlessly. But don't expect me to disappear like a shadow. I'll stay. For the children. For myself. Sarah turned away, then turned sharply to him. So you want to live under the same roof and watch me dissolve into another person? No, I don't want to live with a liar. He walked slowly to the door, stopped, and without turning around, added, but I'm not running away. I'm not the type to give up. You left, and I stayed. He sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching the edges of the armrests. His heart was still shaking, but an icy determination was flowing inside. I'm leaving only when I understand that you really want me to. He was silent and listened to the roar of crying children through the closed door, feeling how this sound was pricking his chest. But I will not leave under the pressure of your anger or guilt. I will take time to understand what I mean, because now I have turned into a shadow that you are afraid to acknowledge and love. And if you yourself cannot live with me, then maybe we should be given a chance to change what is destroyed. Sarah unclenched her fists in amazement. Her eyes glistened with tears, not from weakness, but from a confrontation with a truth that she had been pushing away. She suddenly realized that on the one hand, she was reaching for a new light, for what seemed like freedom, and on the other, she was looking straight into the face of the man she had betrayed. He was still there. Not just physically. He was sitting in front of her, not shouting, not accusing, speaking as one speaks when saying goodbye, not wishing ill. And in this silence, filled with rustlings of restrained anger, in the pauses between phrases like slaps in the face, the realization fell upon her. In front of her was not only her husband, but the very one who had been holding her hand all this time. The only one who was there when she forgot who she was. She saw herself from the outside. She saw in him a lot in her youth, where love began. That hot, living glow of something truly dear flashed for a moment. Her breathing became irregular. Somewhere deep, almost on a subconscious level, it broke through. He's still around. It's not over yet. But the thought slammed shut, crushed by the resentment ignited by his direct words, the ones that cut like glass. Her lips trembled, but she remained silent. Because behind the pain came fear, fear of seeing what damage has been done, and the fear of not being able to fix it. The house was filled with a dry, uneasy silence, the kind that comes after a storm. Sarah stood up silently, went into the bathroom, grabbed a handkerchief from the sink, blew her nose, and looked in the mirror for a long time. The words stung like fresh cuts, but she already knew this night was not the end. This was a turning point, and it could be a beginning. Alex rose slowly. He stood, looking at the door, as if there was not a passage in front of him, but a fork. His heart was beating dully, as if from the inside against the walls of an empty house. It was a mixture of pain, fatigue, resentment, and yet, somewhere on the edge, a quiet, stubborn hope. He did not know where to go, but Livetta didn't want to. He took a step towards the exit of the room, but then, from the dark corner, her voice sounded. I need time. These were not words of farewell, not a plea, not a confession. This was something that was born in the ashes, still without form, but already content. This was a sign, I hear. The silence returned, but this time it sounded different, like a room after a difficult confession. Alex stopped, did not turn around, but said calmly, Fine. He went out. The door did not slam. The house was again immersed in the sounds of the night. The children's breathing, the ticking of the clock, the wind outside the window. In a world where betrayal is the norm, we choose to be different. We show those who did not cheat, who did not sell, who remained faithful to himself, his country, his principles. If you are one of them, this channel is for you. Subscription is your support. Like is your sign. I'm with you. Almost at dawn, Alex lay down on the living room sofa, his legs tucked up, his knees clasped, like a boy seeking support within himself. Fog swirled outside the window, and the sky was beginning to lighten. Something important inside him was broken, but not destroyed. His heart ached, but it was not silent. It continued to beat, not for her, not for the memories, but for something new. And in that pain, strangely, for the first time in a long time, he felt his breath alive. Because a miracle, even if destroyed, could still happen. At night, the autumn wind held the last whisper of coolness in its palms, passing along the windows as if looking inside, pondering, whether to remind about itself or let it be forgotten. Alex lay on the old sofa in the living room, covered with a blanket, and felt how sleep slowly crept closer, trying to embrace, to press to itself. But the mind clung to the remains of the day, to the voice, to the image, to the words that still sounded in the air, "I need time." He opened his eyes and glanced at the wall opposite. There were photographs hanging there, their past, frozen in frames. In the semi-darkness, one of them, the three of them on the shore of a lake, cast a faint shadow on the wallpaper. And although the eye noticed a faded spot in the corner, the soul felt the opposite. A surge of warmth that flared not from the light, but from memory. Those moments had not faded. As long as he remembered them, they were alive. He reached for the remote and switched on the night light. The lamp above the bookshelf flared with a soft amber light, as if it didn't want to disturb the night. He sat up, feeling for the thin blue spine between the volumes of technical manuals and science fiction novels. It was that very one photo album was a gift for their 8th anniversary, made by Sarah when she still wrote confessions on the flyleaf rather than farewells. Alex opened it carefully, as if he was afraid to disturb the peace of the pages. The lamp touched the photographs with golden reflections, and the memory slowly came to life. In one of the first, their hands were intertwined, fingers clenched tight as ropes, against a sunset sky. In another, he was wearing a silly apron, holding a whisk, and Sarah was laughing while Lou, still a toddler, was spreading cream across the table. It was morning, the coffee smelled real, and there was a homey, simple joy in every detail. He lingered on the picture of Sarah looking straight into the camera, smiling not for the sake of the picture, but for his sake. There was that warm tremor in her gaze, a quiet trust that didn't require words. He didn't know how the coffee machine worked, and didn't remember the name of the movie they'd watched that day. But he did remember the way she held the cup with both hands, the way her little finger trembled slightly, the way she inhaled the aroma of the coffee, as if trying to capture a moment of happiness. The pages turned, rustling like leaves in late autumn. From the semi-darkness, photographs responded. They lived not as images, but as evidence of what had been and what, perhaps, still is, maybe. 2 years ago, they were lying on this same sofa, late at night after a long, tiring day, when the house fell asleep before them. Sarah was talking about her dream, a small gallery studio, a place where architecture merges with interior, where one could breathe in form and color, receive people, create a space with a soul. Alex listened attentively, almost spellbound. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded, as if agreeing with every word she said on a blood level. And in his head, it was as if his own design was taking place. Tattoos of light lines, abstract schemes that he applied to the drawing of her dream, mentally connecting the parts. He thought, one day, give up everything, join her, just become the person who will make her idea a reality. He didn't know then how deeply this idea had grown into him, how, without realizing it, he was building a world inside himself that revolved around it. But memory knows no mercy. It brings everything both light and shadow. And then another image emerged before him. Not long ago, they were sitting in a movie theater. She was holding his hand. They weren't watching a movie at all. They were scrolling through their old photos on their phone screen, reminiscing. Sarah laughed, showing him a wedding photo, two prickly spiders, as she joked then, a programmer and a designer who had escaped the world for the sake of their strange, funny, real union. In one shot, she had cream on her nose, in another, a fluttering dress on the seashore, where they never returned. He hugged her knees when she started talking again about how they could make the world a little cozier together. There, in the dimly lit room, for a moment he believed again in we. Now it all felt like a splinter. These memories weren't just the past. They were sharp blades cutting through his chest. He looked at each photo with the same sick attention people give to someone they love and lose. And yet, he did not give up. He said to himself, "If I were truly indifferent, she would no longer remember my name, her gaze would not tremble, she would not confuse words, she would not look away when I stand next to her." He saw a crack in her, and it wasn't a weakness, it was an opportunity. Every minute he spent with the photo album in his hands revived something that had been dormant in him for a long time, feeling of connection, deep, ineradicable, beneath the skin. He remembered why he had chosen her in the first place. Not for the sake of image, not for the sake of habit, but because she had ignited the part of him that was real. And there he was, in the middle of the night, in an empty house, with a soft light above the shelf and the scent of the past. He realized this union was more important than peace. He wanted to return not the past. No, he wanted to create a new truth based on the one that remained. Not revenge, not a fight for the right to be right. And the chance is to return fire, which did not burn, but warmed. He knew that if he changed, if he learned to be again who he once was, not for her sake, but for herself, then, perhaps, she will see in him not a shadow, but the very man whom she once chose. And it was no longer despair. This was the beginning of the movement. As the first rays of dawn softly touched the bedroom windows, Alex went down to the kitchen, led by the subtle but familiar smell of freshly baked goods. The air was filled with warmth and cinnamon, the same scent that once meant home. Sarah usually left glossy design magazines on the table, arranged by topic, with corners tucked into favorite spreads. But today there was only a carefully placed plate with a piece of cheesecake on it, still warm, with nut crumbs on top, and a piece of paper next to it. His own handwriting. He immediately recognized the lines, even if the letters had become harder, clearer, more mature. The first piece of cheesecake with cinnamon and nuts is for the most wonderful wife. I remember you can't deny yourself. And no one has ever been able to surpass your children's casserole. I love you very much. He unfolded the sheet of paper and looked at it for a long time, as if it were a letter not from himself, but to himself, the old, living, attentive one. The text echoed in him with warmth such that it tickled and hurt at the same time. He knew. First he cried, then he cooked. He did everything automatically, but not senselessly. It was as if he baked a piece of his own heart to remind himself why he was waking up. And now he has made a decision, a real one. From that morning on, his own transformation began. He didn't want to be a shadow any more caring, but inactive. He wanted to become himself, not the one he had been in recent months, tired, stubborn, mute, but the one he had once conquered her. He decided he would fight not with anger, not with jealousy, not with pain, but care and attention. He will not bring flowers from the store, but will collect them out of silence, out of business, out of sincere curiosity about her. He knew true love cannot suddenly stop loving. It can only be lost within oneself, and he was going to lose it. Return, dissolving in kindness, created not for the sake of a gesture, but for her sake, for their sake. "Sarah, are you awake?" he called quietly towards the stairs, without turning around, just stirring his coffee. She appeared a moment later, in a light robe, her hair disheveled, her eyes still showing the remnants of sleep, but the morning light was visible in their faces, more than just awakening. There was confusion, fear, timid anticipation, and a tiny, almost timid smile, like the first ray through the clouds. She held his note in her hands, clutching it to her chest like a treasure. She slowly moved closer, leaned over, and kissed him on the cheek. It wasn't a kiss that asked for forgiveness. It just was. As a fulcrum. A question flashed in her gaze, unspoken but familiar. "Do you remember us?" Alex just nodded. He didn't need words. All the answers were already there in the hot mug, in the soft breathing of the kitchen, in their shared silence that no longer needed to be filled. It wasn't the beginning, and not the end. It was a continuation, and he knew there was a chance, and he would take it. At breakfast, they were more silent than they talked, but that breakfast was different, with a long-forgotten taste and a feeling that their story would continue. After that bright morning of silent reconciliation, Alex felt a pleasant buoyancy inside, not excitement, not euphoria, but a calm, steady resolve. The shower had been cool, almost mentally refreshing. He had chosen his clothes carefully, a clean white shirt, a warm gray jacket, and a turquoise tie, the one he remembered Sarah always liking. Not flashy, but lively. He hadn't worn it in over a year. Before leaving, he picked up a box from his favorite bakery. Inside were apple cinnamon puff pastries, fragrant, still warm, with golden crumbs. They smelled of morning goodness and something childish, like a flashback to old breakfasts. Sarah was standing by the kettle, brewing fresh jasmine tea. Her hair was pulled back casually, and her eyes were still sleepy. She noticed him first, with a glance that slid slightly over his tie. But it was his eyes that stopped her. There was something new about them. Or rather, something forgotten. "Where are you going?" she asked, her fingers instinctively touching his sleeve. The touch was almost reflexive. "There's a special occasion," he said, grinning. He brushed cinnamon crumbs off his cuff and set the box on the edge of the table. "Today is your whole day. No chores, no lists, no kitchens, no plans. Imagine, Mom and Dad are going to have a meeting where you're free to do whatever you want. Not have to, but can." Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Are you serious?" she said slowly, lowering herself into the chair. There was caution in her voice. It was as if she didn't believe that she was allowed to believe. Alex nodded. "Absolutely. I've taken care of everything. The nanny is on her way. I'll feed the kids myself and take them for a walk. And you? You go wherever you want. Spa bookstore, a sea of vanilla lattes, the choice is yours." He sat down next to her, reaching out and lightly touching her knee. Sarah remained silent, looking from him to the box, as if trying to figure out if this was a dream. Then she said, "You. You never did anything like that. Just like that." "Exactly." He smiled. "And now just like that. Because you deserve it 100 times. And I may not have noticed how much you needed rest and care." Sarah tightened her fingers around the cup. Her breathing slowed in the silence of the kitchen. She didn't answer right away, just looked at him a little differently, without reproach, with cautious but already warming gratitude. This was the beginning. Later, when she finally left with a blanket over her shoulders, a hint of confusion in her eyes, but with a step that was not alarming, Alex continued. He called the cosmetologist she had once mentioned in passing and ordered an on-site treatment for the evening. He brought home ampoules of vitamins and minerals, the very ones she often put off for later, forgetting where she had put them. He placed them carefully on her bedside table with a note, "I remember, and you don't forget about yourself." He handed Lou a special pastry, the one with the caramel crumbs that made her slurp her lips with delight every time. He hugged his daughter, held her close, and whispered, "My girl, today you are drawing the whole universe. Will you show me later?" He took out the toy, the one Lou had picked out 3 months ago, shown on her phone, and then forgotten. But he hadn't forgotten. And then the book. He held it in his hands for a long time before wrapping it in paper. The book about artistic spaces that Sarah had once mentioned in a dream. "If I had a corner where the walls themselves breathe." Now he had it, wrapped with a ribbon. He placed it on the shelf, not as a gift, but as a quiet reminder, "I'm listening, and I'm here." During these days, Alex learned to be close again, not just physically, but with his soul. He let care, warmth, even light romance into his everyday life, which he had previously put off for later. He could still talk for hours about the project, about the little things in the code or the team, but now he started with something different. "I saw you smile when you read the letter yesterday. It was better than any report of the day." He began to give compliments not as routine phrases, but as confessions simple, but lively. You're amazing. The way you keep everything under control, I would break. Even our table looks cozier when you're around. This house has become a place where I want to return, because of you. At first, Sarah waved it off, sometimes even growling slightly, as if she was defending herself. Alex, stop. Don't start. But there was something vulnerable in her eyes more and more often. With each new gesture, he seemed to peel away one layer of her fatigue, adding hope in its place. One evening, when she returned home in a silent mood, Alex met her with a trunk. It contained small vegetables from the farm and a bunch of fresh flowers. On the sofa, there was a tray, a vanilla cupcake, a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, and a soft blanket. I know you work a lot, he said, handing her the mug, and the last few days haven't been the easiest. You deserve at least half an hour of complete peace, just for yourself. No tasks, no conversations, just you. Sarah was taken aback for a second. She held the mug in her hands as if she didn't believe he was serious. But she didn't argue. It wasn't a gesture for effect, not a theatrical attempt. Alex wasn't staging a scene from a movie. He wasn't ordering restaurants. He wasn't spouting quotes from novels. He was simply reminded of itself through care, through details, through the repeated, I'm here. When the children were already sleeping peacefully in the evening and the house was quiet again, Alex went to the kitchen corner. He put the last two pieces of plum pie on the table and brewed strong tea in their old, worn mugs, the same ones they had bought in their first shared home. He didn't talk about the weather like he used to. He didn't start the conversation with the news. He just looked into her eyes and asked, how are you feeling? Honestly, no filter. It was unexpected, but Sarah answered, a few phrases uncertain, disorganized, with pauses, and he listened, without judgment, without advice, just was near. At some point she froze, narrowed her eyes, and asked a question that he couldn't look away from. What's going on, Alex? Why is this happening? She said it almost in a whisper, but there was more confusion in her voice than accusation. He smiled, not the forced smile that covers fear, but a quiet, calm, deeply real smile. It's me, he said. I just want to be the one you feel good with again. For real. Her gaze froze. There were no tears, no surge of emotion, just a pause, a long one, and in that pause there was warmth. In the previous days, she had avoided talking, but now, in his voice, in his actions, there was no guilt, no pressure. There was light not bright, not demanding, but one that does not press in the eyes, but leads in the darkness. And in her silence, he realized, perhaps she was not yet ready to forgive, not ready to return. But she hears him, which means they still have a chance. Gradually, this insensitivity receded. She no longer immediately looked away from his chest when he looked at her. The girl in her wanted to believe that he was still there, that he would not leave her and abandon her, although it seemed an easy lie now, when all words were gold and fears were the background to it. But Sarah was not blind or deaf, and while she remained calm on the outside, inside her mind was reacting at a different speed, in different dimensions. The world around her was changing, but her perceptions were lagging, as if her heart could not keep up with someone else's intentions. She felt it especially in the body's gestures in what had once been natural, but now became almost frightening. In the morning, when Alex was about to leave for the office, he tried to kiss her on the cheek, to hug her as he had done before tenderly, with sincerity that was neither artificial nor forced. But Sarah involuntarily shuddered, lightly, almost imperceptibly. She took a half step back, and a look of alarm flashed in her eyes. The room froze. Alex fell silent, and in that pause something broke. Sarah looked at him, trying to understand why the simple touch she had once reached out to first now felt foreign. Why this movement, familiar and soft, was suddenly dangerous. As if everything in her body refused to let him back, and not because she didn't love him, but because she was afraid. Afraid of repetition, of pain, of weakness. Last night, she almost made up her mind. She wanted to get out of this triangle. Stop everything. Close it. Switch off Daniel. Block the shadow of a new attachment. Free her heart. But at night, already lying in bed, she reached for the phone again and dialed his answer short, like a sigh. I think about us. But I'm afraid. Forgive me for confusing you. Rationality dissolved. All that remained was the feeling. She needs someone who feels her, and this someone, contrary to her intentions, was not Alex yet. In the morning, Sarah woke up in a slight shock. It was as if she had caught herself on the edge. Everything was in place: the house, the children, the kettle, the light switch, but something inside her was cracking like old glass. She kept repeating to herself, I need to figure this out. I really need to figure out what's going on with me. Alex's gesture at the door only added to the confusion. It was kind, sincere, but against the backdrop of her inner storm, it became like an anchor, pulling her into something she wasn't sure she wanted to save. He was sucking pity out of her, and pity is more terrible than indifference. And yet she felt, his gestures were not manipulation. He simply remained, and she is already somewhere in the middle. At work, at the children's table in the studio, during an informal lunch, she felt dizzy. Sarah slowly moved her spoon through the cream, thoughtfully pressing a piece of tomato between her teeth. Around her, light conversation was going on, colleagues were sharing jokes, someone turned on soft music, but to her, everything seemed sleepy, muffled. She felt like a guest in her own life. Just yesterday, she said to her colleagues with a light, almost playful audacity, Daniel's arrival has given me new inspiration, not only in my work, but also in my life. Some laughed, some winked. Everyone knew that she was passionate about architecture, and no one suspected a trick. Everything seemed logical. A bright project, new creativity, a strong partner, everything is explainable. But by evening, this joke began to weigh too much. Like a burden, she found herself wanting to be honest, at least with someone. To tell them about her confusion, about the silence between her and Alex, about how hard it was to know who you were betraying, more yourself or the one who was still waiting. There was a silent scream inside. I wanted to tear off the mask of confidence and say out loud, I'm scared. I don't know what's right. I don't know what I want. At home, they moved around each other more and more often, as if in a narrow corridor where it was impossible to pass each other, but also scary to touch. Alex continued to be attentive. He cleaned up after the children, cooked, and asked how the day went. His gestures were warm, sincere, but as if directed at an unknown woman whom he was only trying to understand. Sarah responded politely, almost with gratitude, but there was always a lot of air between the phrases. Too much. One evening she returned late, a heavy bag on her shoulder, a jacket in her other hand. Alex came up to her, helped her, deftly took the load off her shoulder, hung up her things, and silently handed her a glass of water. Sarah looked at him and exhaled. Thank you. But you've been so caring lately that I'm starting to think you're just pretending. He froze. His fingers slid off the edge of the table. He didn't immediately know what to say. Then, quietly, with restraint, pretending, he narrowed his eyes as if he had heard something strange. Me? And you? She asked with tired directness, without even looking in his direction. The words hung in the air like an unspoken question, too loud to ignore. He straightened up. He ran his hand nervously over his chin, out of habit. His eyes suddenly became darker. All these days, he began quietly, holding back his voice, I thought that I could at least be useful to you in this way. I thought that if I help silently, don't interfere, don't demand, maybe you'll notice that I'm nearby. I didn't leave. He looked up at her. She was standing by the window, her back turned, her arms folded across her chest. Alex took a breath, his voice trembling. And now you're telling me that I'm playing. It's a little offensive, Sarah. She didn't turn around right away. Then she slowly turned to him, her gaze not hostile, but tired. I don't know, she said. Maybe you really are trying. I'm not sure I can handle it right now. When you're this close, it's like I lose my bearings. I get confused. Alex shook his head. You're getting confused, he chuckled, but without malice. And I, then, must be the one without mistakes, yes. The one who waited, held on, and now, if not perfect, then pretends. I didn't say that, she said quietly. But you thought. A pause. She moved her lips, but said nothing. And then he asked, not loudly, "Tell me honestly, Sarah, are you still with him?" Her eyes widened slightly, and he knew she hadn't expected directness, and he wasn't going to avoid it any longer. She looked down. It's not quite like that. I can't explain it all. But yes, I thought about it. He was there at some point. When you were far away, not physically, you just withdraw into yourself. And I needed something alive, real. And I am not alive. You were. She looked him straight in the face. But not with me. You were in code, in silence, in disappointment, and I was like furniture in a house. He took a step back, sat on the edge of the table, and remained silent. She came closer, carefully. I'm tired, Alex, of masks, of conversations where no one speaks honestly. Maybe I really was pretending too. For the kids, for you, for myself. I don't know where the real me is. He looked at her with a new expression, not as an enemy, not as a traitor, but as a person who could not cope on her own, who was in no less pain. So we both played, he said. She nodded, quietly. And then, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself not to fight, just to be, not to push, not to persuade. He just asked, "Are you afraid?" Sarah nodded again, slowly. "And you?" she asked in response. He looked at her face. The light from the kitchen fell on her cheek, where unfallen tears had frozen, and he said honestly, "Yes, but I'm even more afraid that if we don't do anything now, it will be too late later." Sarah didn't answer. She just sat down next to her. She didn't hug her or take her hand, but remained, and that was enough for that evening. At the table, the night left the room of shadows. They sat down, and, the table creaking, gave way to conversations. He was near, warm and caring. She did not push away anymore. And although her thoughts still furrowed the traces of doubts, they gradually reduced the distance between them. On Sarah's finger lay an impartial ring, which had previously shone with the magic of their love, but now shone differently, still timid, but alive. That night, for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself not to feel ashamed of the love she still hid somewhere, even if it was among the suddenly arisen feelings for another. The familiar rhythm of the house was gradually established, but with a new note of sensitivity. On quiet evenings, they increasingly found themselves simply together, even if they did not know what to do next. The living room was filled with the sounds of children's songs and the television, and they cooked dinner together. Alex stewed vegetables, and Sarah cut up chicken for risotto. Each joint action came unusually naturally. He saw how her hands moved smoothly. Her eyes softened in his presence, and the feeling rising in his chest reminded him of a favorite childhood toy that had been taken away from him as a child. Here it was again. That evening, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. On the table were 2 cups of hot tea and a simple, almost casual treat, a bowl of fresh berries with a spoonful of yogurt. The light was soft, dim, and the room was silent, not awkwardly, but rather with anticipation. Several days had passed since that evening when they had spoken almost on the edge. And now, in this quiet, measured atmosphere, Alex felt the moment approaching again, not like a storm, but like a gentle wind pushing towards frankness. He cleared his throat, looking towards the empty sofa, as if searching for something unsaid. And finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot, all this time, about us, about where we're ultimately going, or where we've already arrived." The words didn't come to him right away. His voice was a little hoarse, as if it was cutting through his inner armor. "The last few weeks have been strange, hard in places, but one thing has become very clear to me. Every moment I see you next to me, it's precious to me, real." Sarah bit the berry silently, looking at him attentively without interrupting. She didn't smile, but she didn't withdraw into herself either. She simply listened, and that was already a lot. I'm listening, she said quietly, closing her eyes as if letting his voice in. Speak. Alex sighed. He spoke neither loudly nor pompously, but rather with the calm that comes after an internal storm. I love you, Sarah. He said it plainly. And honestly, that thought never went away, even when it was bad, even when you were far away. It lived somewhere deep, and it still lives. He kept his eyes on her. It destroys me that I could hurt you, that I became something for you to hide from, that you were tired of me. Sarah lowered her gaze slightly, but did not turn away. I know, he continued, that I spent most of my life keeping my fears quiet, that I was afraid of not being able to cope, of not giving you what you want, what you deserve. But I want to be someone you don't have to pretend to be with, someone I once was and someone I want to be again. Not perfect, but real. Yours. Silence fell between them again, but this time it was different, filled with it. Sarah sighed. Her face was soft, a little tired, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there for a long time, attention, not wariness, not clear analysis, but real human participation. I hear you, Alex, she said. And you know, there's something really important about this. I'm not sure I have the answers. But I, too, I want honesty. Without pressure, without fear. He nodded. The weariness on his face gave way to a slight radiance. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't ask for a solution, just a meeting, and she seemed to really come out to meet him. The small piece of space between them behind the table, above the cups, suddenly became something bigger, almost a bridge, fragile as glass, but already extended. And that evening they needed nothing more. Sarah listened, and inside her a conflicting ocean of feelings boiled. He loved her something that brought pain, because she wanted to believe that her feelings were fair, that everything she did was for someone else, that maybe it was all in vain. She did not know what to answer, but she saw how his eyes sparkled with his own words. She was so dear to such a generous, unique love that he gave her. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, and through tears they simply pressed themselves to each other. This familiar, but still surprising ritual, she carefully bowed her head, and for the first time in a long time allowed him to touch her lips. Her hands on his neck trembled. I too, I love you. Her words came out almost in a whisper. They sounded like a confession and a request. Her voice trembled, as if resisting itself, but finally broke out. Sarah lowered her head, and tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Not violently, not hysterically, just cleansing, like the rain that comes after a long, dusty summer. I'm sorry, she whispered. I kind of lost myself in these 6 months. It all became too much, and I just didn't know who I was. Alex didn't answer. He held out his hand, not with a sharp movement, not like a hero in a drama, but simply held out. And when her fingers found him, squeezed in his palm, he realized that she was in the same pain as he was, just in a different way. She suddenly pulled him closer and wrapped her arms around his neck. The kiss that passed between them was not passionate, it was alive, real, like a breath of air that they both couldn't find for a long time. There, in that touch, that magic that once was between them came to life, not fireworks, not a movie, but a simple, warm closeness that is eaten away by everyday life and fatigue, but which can be returned. For a moment the world disappeared. There was only a room with soft light, the evening outside the window, and two people, he and she, sitting opposite each other, but now not opposite each other, but together. I was so afraid, she said in fragments, pressing her forehead to his cheek. Afraid that it was all over, that you were gone, that I was gone. I had lost my way, but your attempts, they were like beacons, small but visible. And I suddenly realized that maybe everything was still possible, that there was something to hold on to. Alex was silent. He just listened and held her. I'm scared, Alex. I'm not sure of myself, of you, of us. But if I had to choose what to bet on, I'd bet on us. Not out of a sense of duty, but because I still want to be with you. He pulled her closer to him, slowly stroking her back, as if saying, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Words were no longer necessary. Everything that needed to be said had already been laid in the air between them, not as a stone, but as a bridge. They sat like that, quietly, listening to each other's breathing, until the evening outside laughed with a golden glow, the last reflection of the setting sun. Children's laughter somewhere in the bedroom turned into a whisper and then died down completely, dissolving into dreams. The house was plunged into semi-darkness. Only the candle on the windowsill cast a warm tremor on their silhouettes. Sarah looked up and ran her fingers down his cheek, as if checking that he was still there, that this wasn't her imagination. Alex took her hand, brushed his lips over her knuckles, and they both smiled slightly. It was a smile that held everything: pain, forgiveness, hope. They were left alone, alone with new words that did not need a voice. They whispered silently with lips, gestures, skin. The kisses grew deeper. The hugs grew longer. The hands found each other anew, as if for the first time, and each moment of their closeness became fragile, but real. They didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but they knew, now this is the beginning, not of a fairy tale, but of life. The very one that, if you take care of it, you can live again together. Then came the day when Sarah couldn't take it anymore and had to tell everything. By the morning, Alex had already felt an unpleasant tension in the air. Their entire small apartment seemed to be holding its breath, and he began to suspect that that very night of intimacy, although full of tenderness, was not the final step. He saw the anxiety in her eyes when she prepared breakfast, and heard how her voice trembled hesitantly when she asked how the night had gone. Both anxiety and fear were growing inside Alex. Something would finally be decided on this day. He pretended that everything was simply going on as usual, although he understood. Today was his meeting with the past, and everything had to come out. Sarah packed her things and confirmed that she was going to meet Daniel, but she did it as if by force of will, without asking Alex's permission. After breakfast, putting the cups in the sink, she went out to the balcony to find some air to think. Alex saw her tired face. Lack of sleep and anxiety were taking their toll. He came out, quietly put his hand on her shoulder, looked into her eyes, and seemed to let out a bitter groan. "Let's talk about everything." His voice was firm, but a deep, wordless jerk flashed through it. She began, but her voice was breaking. She looked at his face, sighed, then continued quietly, "I want to tell you everything honestly. What I did was selfish and wrong, but you deserve an explanation." Her fingers closed on the balcony railing. "I had an affair with Daniel." Alex's heart stopped. The bottom dropped out from under him. He instantly felt his mind break away from reality, racing away into the distance. One heartbeat, too. His mouth went dry. "I didn't want to lie," she continued quickly, "but I didn't want to touch that wound either. It's all behind us now." Alex felt his breathing return to normal, slow and dull, his body resigned to another blow to his chest, ready to bear it. "Tell me everything from beginning to end," he asked quietly, his face calm as marble. She closed her eyes and, after a few seconds, began to speak without interruption. "It started a few months ago. I was working on a project for a very important client, a new apartment complex, and there was an architect named Daniel hired for the project. I had known him for a long time, but not particularly. He needed a design. We started dating. At first he was just a colleague, asking for clarifications, bringing sketches. But over the months, trying to finish the project together, we spent evenings in the office, and sometimes even nights discussing. Every time you left me alone after work, my thoughts were left with echoes of our conversations. It took me a while to realize what was happening. There were informal dinners on the project, and congratulations on successes. One day I realized how sorry I was that you were not there when I laughed at his jokes. He was so attentive, listening to me, and I began to feel like I was young again, and not like the exhausted mother you no longer noticed. He seemed different, a different man, and I selflessly gave myself the freedom to think that I was thirsting for exactly this kind of ease and adventure. It was a mistake." Tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I felt alone," she continued, almost in a whisper. You were, you were a disappointment to me, Alexander. Routine calm, and when Daniel encouraged me, told me I was doing an outstanding job, creating something new. I began to give back. And for a while it felt better, while we were all working on the same project, and then there was the feeling until the most insane morning cold. I understood that I was living a lie, that I was hurting the person I needed. She spoke for a long time, without pauses. She talked about how she hugged someone else's phone at night, texting him, about quiet dates in cafes where nothing reminded her of children or his care, about how they shared secrets about big dreams as if they were teenagers in love. He thought to himself how she would not cry like that for a long time, but now he did not try to stifle the tears that flowed down his cheek. Her voice trembled, but at the same time, it seemed that she was cleansing herself of a heavy burden. All this time, she finished, he cared about me, but not better than you did. Honestly, he was just another version of you. And now I understand everything. I'm so scared. I wanted to tell you yesterday, but I thought I could hold it in until I figured out how to save myself. And last night, when we were talking, she took a sharp breath and was silent. Alex closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself hold on. I realized, he took the floor, I realized that everything I felt for you. His voice broke. That all this hatred is just what I say. When you know that all your past feelings are a lie, and the truth turns out to be so bitter, but maybe unexpectedly terribly tender in its simplicity, I want to believe that we can fix everything. Sarah looked at him as if trying to absorb every drop of his words. Her eyes were shining not with tears of pain, but with the knowledge that this was true, that everything he said lived inside him. She smiled gratefully, uncertainly, tenderly, femininely, truly. And then they embraced again slowly, carefully, as if returning to an old, familiar space that both were afraid to destroy. Her lips felt the warmth of his skin. In these embraces there was remorse, forgiveness, that same salty, bitter taste of love, which, despite everything, is still alive. I love you so much, Alex whispered in her ear, and I don't just say it like that. She nodded, clinging closer to him. There was no need to answer. She gave in, not as weakness, but as a choice, as a willingness to be close again. They cried, both of them, but not from weakness, but from long-awaited relief. Everything that had accumulated, unspoken, disappointed suddenly flowed in tears and dissolved. In this silence that followed the confessions, there was something new, something pure. The pain pierced them, but it seemed to cut a hole, through which, finally, air entered. For the first time in a long time, their hearts breathed freely. The words ended. The tears dried. The sun rose slowly over the house, not just a new morning, but a new chapter. They returned to their normal lives, but as if on a new line, with slightly clearer boundaries, with a more honest heart and patience for the pain of others. Mornings began to bring light into the house again. The children laughed at breakfast, dropping spoons and making up songs about cereal. Alex and Sarah shared glances, brief but meaningful. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of silence where shadows hid. There were flashes when someone suddenly closed in again. But now a bond began to grow between them, Colonel quiet, strong, built on effort. They knew that in order to preserve this new space, they had to learn to talk otherwise. So after a few days, Alex suggested, "Look, I was thinking, maybe we should try going to a counselor together, not as a last resort, but to learn to listen better, to understand, to not get lost again." Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked at his face, at the look in which there was no pressure, no excuses, only sincerity, and she nodded. "Yes, I want to. We need it. Not to fix each other, but to not lose what's left." So they started going to a marriage counselor together, not because things were bad, but because they wanted things to get better. These weren't rescue sessions, but sessions growing. Small steps. Learn to talk about fears without offending. Hear the pause between words. Respond thoughtfully, not automatically. Acknowledge, yes, I'm not perfect, but I'm with you and I'm ready to work. One evening, after several meetings, they sat next to each other on the old sofa. The same one where they had been silent before. Now they were hugging, Children's laughter could be heard from the next room. "I am thinking so strangely right now," Sarah whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "I want to be different, better, but not for someone else, for myself, for us." Alex looked at her and smiled. The smile was tired, but deep. "We all change. The main thing is to change together. We've been through this, and we have a chance to love each other again, just the way we are now." He took her hand. She intertwined her fingers with his. The world around them became warmer, not because everything became easy, but because now they had a tool for shared silence and shared true hand. This was already a completely different together. Sunday became a holiday of a simple home. Together they cooked dinner. The three of them got ready for a walk in the park. In the evenings, they hugged on armchairs by the fireplace. Of course, not everything was easy. Not all fears had dissolved. Former wounds were dragged by the shadow of fear and even jealousy, but they discussed every tear, every hope. Alex told Sarah about how he worked on himself, learned to listen, was more attentive, helped her with the children. And Sarah tried to love the sunsets with him again, not hiding from conversations. Over time, the tension went away, and their home became easier to breathe. Sarah stopped reading the correspondence from the past every morning because there was no longer a shadow of the need to hide. Under their fingers on the floor, they again felt the warmth of space because there were no more prickly fish left from despair and resentment that could bite their shoulders. They found a way to move on without gritting their teeth, but by agreeing with each other, without unnecessary silence, which ruins relationships. A year later, on another anniversary night, Alex pulled out a stunned photo album hidden from view and gave it to Sarah, the one with the "Don't Give Up" note. The album of their life together was now filled with new, happy faces, but there was also the page where that note had been written and the line, "We made it." Sarah opened it with tears and a smile, realizing that a new chapter had been written, full of pain but also forgiveness, and its pages now promised to move on. They held hands again, walking home from the park where children were playing in the golden maple leaves. The evening sky wrapped them softly. "Every day I will fight for us," Alex said, looking up at the starry sky, and Sarah smiled back. She put her arms around his shoulders and leaned her face against his back, feeling his warmth. They were starting over, two kindred spirits who had been through thick and thin and realized that a new chapter in their lives was beginning now, every day anew. Thank you for listening to the end. If you like this story, please support it with a like and a comment. It really inspires us to create new episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. It will definitely surprise you. See you soon, and may your life be filled with more good stories. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.